Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Faithful America's series, Project 2025 is Project Theocracy, the Christian-Nationalist Roots of Project 2025. Today's webinar, the third in this series, is called MAGA's Project 2025 is Project Everything, because we'll be focusing on how Project 2025 touches on, well, just about everything, just about every issue that Americans care about. We'll look at 4 issues in particular: climate change, the death penalty, LGBTQ equality, and abortion access. Today's webinar is the last scheduled in the series, but I will note it's going well. This is a dire, pressing, urgent topic. We might just add 1 or 2 more next month after all. Stay tuned for more about that. My name is the Reverend Nathan Empsall. I am the Executive Director of Faithful America, as well as an Episcopal priest. And I'm very excited to be joined in a few minutes by our guests, Zoya Teirstein from Grist, Abraham Bonowitz from Death Penalty Action, and Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons from Interfaith Alliance. Now, for those joining us for the first time, Faithful America is the largest online community of grassroots Christians, roughly 200,000 members, putting faith into action for love and social justice and against the religious right's Christian nationalist hijacking of our faith. Our motto is love thy neighbor, no exceptions. Now, it's okay if you didn't catch the first 2 episodes in this series, but they were pretty good conversations, if I do say so myself, and we'll have links to them, to the YouTube videos in the chat shortly. I do, however, before bringing in our guests, want to take just a minute to sum up what Project 2025 is, in case you missed those 2 videos, just as a quick table setter for the discussion we're about to have. The too long did not read version, TLDR, is that Project 2025 is a 900-page document laying out an authoritarian agenda for the next Republican presidential administration. It was written by the Heritage Foundation and a host of current and former Trump aides. It was guided by an advisory committee of Christian nationalist organizations. And although Donald Trump says he knows nothing about it, he did brag that the Heritage Foundation, at a Heritage Foundation fundraising dinner, would be laying out the vision for his next term. So he may not have heard about the name they gave that vision, but this is what he said he wanted them to do, and it was written by his aides. Project 2025 seeks to expand executive authority and enact a theocratic agenda of ripping away basic freedoms through such measures as dismantling public education, the Department of Education itself, gutting funding for public education, removing most public welfare and other poverty and social safety net programs, so much for the least of these, dismantling our immigration system in racist ways, and militarizing the National Guard to do it, and so much more, including the issues we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But Project 2025 isn't just about these freedom-denying policies. It's also about how to accomplish those policies, right? The Heritage Foundation puts out one of these agendas in every presidential election. This one is more extreme than ever before and longer, but the real difference is the authoritarian roadmap to how to get it done. They encourage Trump, or whoever the next Republican president may be, to expand executive authority in extra-constitutional ways, to change thousands upon thousands of civil service jobs to political appointees, so that he can just put whoever he wants into the jobs instead of relying on who's already there, and fire people without federal or union protections in case they don't enact Project 2025. Project 2025 also stacks the administration with like-minded young applicants by spending months building a huge resume bank of far-right job seekers to just hand the presidential transition team so they don't have to take the time to find those applicants for themselves. So why are we talking about Project 2025 today? 2 real reasons. First, it is a Christian nationalist document. It takes pains to hide this, but that's the truth. And that's our focus at Faithful America, is reclaiming our faith from Christian nationalism so it does not misrepresent us or harm people in Jesus' name. Project 2025 is a piece of that hijacking of faith, and it's deeply harmful. Note that many of the policies, like the ones we're talking about today in particular, particularly abortion access and LGBTQ rights, are policies that are only advanced for religious reasons. You know, when folks try to take away marriage equality, it's almost exclusively because of fundamentalism. So that is a Christian nationalism issue, even when they hide the religious rhetoric. Furthermore, look at the advisory committee behind Project 2025. It's the James Dobson Institute. It's the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's that hate group, the Family Research Council from Tony Perkins. Where you find James Dobson and Tony Perkins and all these other groups, Hillsdale College, you find Christian nationalism. Second, talking about Project 2025 is a great way to motivate people to get to the polls. And I will note that many of our guests are representing 501c3 nonprofits. They're not here to advocate for or against candidates, but Faithful America, just speaking for ourselves, does oppose Donald Trump. And talking about Project 2025 motivates people to oppose Donald Trump at the polls. 77% of voters are familiar with it. 55% of voters report having heard something negative about Project 2025. 72% oppose the policies that are in it, including 69% of independents and 48% of Republicans. And 75% of those who have heard of Project 2025 do associate it with Donald Trump, even more associate it with congressional Republicans, despite their best efforts to distance themselves from their own work. But here's the real kicker. According to the Global Strategy Group and its polling, Project 2025 cost Republican candidates a net 14 points on the generic ballot when you tell voters they support Project 2025 and the generic Democrat opposes it. It also motivates people who are against those Trump Republicans to go to the polls better than any other ads that were tested. So talk about Project 2025 to your loved ones as much as anything when you're trying to get them to vote. This is the key issue in this election. Now, one final announcement before I bring in our guests and hear from each of them, and they'll be coming on camera now. Because I know this is the question we're going to get asked the most. Yes, we are recording this webinar, and we will send out YouTube and Facebook links probably tomorrow, certainly this week, to everyone who registered. We will include in that email, probably in that email, all of the links that you'll find to the chat today. Certainly they will be in the caption on YouTube, so you can find all the links we share today. We will also be taking your questions later in the 75 or so minutes we're about to spend together. We'll hear from each of our panelists, and then we'll take questions all at once. Please feel free to use the Q&A box that's down below to share your questions as we go along. We won't answer them as they come in. We'll answer them at the end. But if you have a question, go ahead, type it in so you don't forget it later. And if you see a chat box, don't use that. We are using the Q&A feature. So with that, I'm going to read our three panelists' bios, and then we'll start by hearing from Zoya. Zoya Teirstein. I'm sorry, Zoya, I didn't ask you beforehand. Did I pronounce that last name right?
Yeah, perfectly.
All right, thank you. Zoya Teirstein is a staff writer at Grist, covering climate politics and the impacts of climate change on human health. Grist is a nonprofit, independent climate solutions media organization. My background is actually before seminary and the priesthood. My background is in climate action. I have a master's in environmental management, and I've been reading Grist as a main source of environmental and climate news for decades. It's fantastic. Zoya's work can also be found in Rolling Stone, Wired, and the Associated Press, and her recent article for Grist on Project 2025 was also picked up by Yale University's Yale Climate Connections. She has received awards from the Indigenous Journalists Association, the SEAL Awards, and the Society of Environmental Journalists. After Zoya, we'll hear from Abraham Bonowitz. My friend Abe is the executive director of deathpenaltyaction.org, and we'll share this and other links in the chat soon. The leading national single-issue anti-death penalty organization in the United States. Abe used to support the death penalty until he tried to prove that it works, and instead became convinced that capital punishment is a public policy failure on moral, economic, social, and faith-based grounds. Death Penalty Action works to stop executions and abolish the death penalty through advocacy, education, and action. We're very grateful to Abe for being here today because, unfortunately, this is the worst week of the year to date for executions, with 2 federal and 2 state executions this week. Abe is very busy right now doing the Lord's work. And then finally, we'll hear from Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons, our old friend now at the Interfaith Alliance. Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Interfaith Alliance, which is a network of people of diverse faiths and beliefs from across the country, working together to build a resilient democracy and to protect religious freedom for all. Guthrie is one of the country's top advocates and experts working at the intersection of religion, politics, and policy. Prior to joining Interfaith Alliance in August 2024, just last month, he worked at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and did excellent work helping lead its Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, where we partnered together on a number of things against the Reawaken America tour, among other campaigns. And he didn't put this in his bio, but I'm going to brag that prior to his work at BJC, Guthrie was, among other things, a freelance writer and campaign consultant for us here at Faithful America, and we do miss him. Guthrie writes regularly about faith communities and social justice, and his expertise has been featured in the New York Times, MSNBC, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC News, the Daily Beast, USA Today, Religion News Service, and yet more. He is the author of the book, Just Faith, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity, available from Broadleaf Books. It's a great read, and we will have that link in the comments soon. So my huge thanks to Zoya, Abe, and Guthrie, and if we were in a room, I'd ask for your raucous applause now. But we're going to begin with Zoya, who's going to tell us about Project 2025, climate change, and environmental regulations. Thank you, Zoya.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And I'm glad to hear that you're sort of an OG Grist reader. We don't get very many of those now, so that's really great to hear. So yeah, my name is Zoya. I work for Grist, which is a climate change magazine, as the Reverend said. And I am going to go through sort of a general overview of how this document may or may not affect climate policy in the US. As you heard, this is a blueprint. It's not a given that this will be adopted if Trump were to be reelected. However, we know that from previous administrations, the Heritage Foundation has been very influential in Republican politics throughout the decades, since about the 1980s. And so what we know also from 2016 is that about 2/3 of their blueprint put out in 2015 were either implemented or considered under Trump in his first term. So it's safe to assume that some element of this document will be put into action if Trump were to be reelected. And the way that this document would affect climate policy in the US is hard to sum up in, a few minutes, but I'll do my best. It's really far-reaching, and it affects almost every aspect of what we call the administrative state. So that's the federal agencies that make up the government. And as you heard, there's this focus on the executive branch, on expanding presidential powers while shrinking the so-called bureaucracy of the federal government. The problem when it comes to climate change and fighting it is that so much of combating rising temperatures and rising emissions relies on policies and regulations that reduce those emissions. And so the federal government has a lot to do with that. The first thing that I think pertains most to climate change within this document is this unleashing of national resources. So oil, gas, coal, all the sources of fossil fuels that we know need to stay more or less entirely in the ground if we are to ensure a livable planet. This document, the blueprint, advocates for completely unfettering oil and gas drilling across the United States. Now, what's interesting about that is that President Biden, in his first 3 years in office, actually approved 50% more oil and gas leases on federal lands than Trump did in the first 3 years of his first term. So there's this sort of mismatch between what the Heritage Foundation thinks that Democrats have been doing versus what they're actually doing. But the document calls for going much further than what's happening now, unleashing offshore drilling in ways that have not yet been seen, opening up new national monuments like Bears Ears National Monument for drilling for oil and gas, exporting far more natural gas than we already do when we export a whole lot. So in all, it's sort of unfettering the limited constraints on oil and gas production in the US is sort of agenda item number 1 in this document when it comes to the climate crisis writ large. And I should note that, obviously there are so many different topics within Project 2025, but climate change and environmental policy rank among the top 3, I would say. I mean, references to climate policy and what the Heritage Foundation views as an overreach of government in the climate arena are imbued throughout the document. So it's not just large-scale items such as, unleashing American energy independence, as they call it, but also smaller items such as, for example, preventing the EPA from assessing it's called the co-benefits or the knock-on effects of its policies. So if the EPA, for example, would like to put out a policy that would reduce emissions from power plants in, certain states, then the agency could look at how that policy affects, for example, frontline communities living near those power plants who have been affected by air pollution from those facilities for decades. If this project were to be implemented, then the EPA would be prevented from assessing the positive benefits of its policy. So it wouldn't be able to say, well, this is a good idea, not only because it reduces emissions in these ways, but also because it positively benefits the frontline communities who are suffering from the impacts of these power plants. That's just one small example. There are also sort of, as some experts explained to me, nonsensical suggestions in there, such as moving the Federal Emergency Management Administration out from under the Department of Homeland Security to the Department of Transportation is one suggestion in that document. I'm not sure that the Heritage Foundation understands what goes into moving an agency from one place to another within the federal government, but it is an enormous undertaking that experts told me would set back disaster relief in the United States by years. Now, as you all probably know who are listening and watching, we've had a number of very extreme disasters this summer already. The pace of disasters and the pace of worsening weather events in general has been increasing as temperatures rise. The atmosphere is holding more moisture, more evaporation. So, constraining FEMA from doing its job, it's stretched pretty thin already, would be a problem. There are a couple of policies related to climate change and in the environment in the document that experts told me might be good ideas. For example, right now, states shoulder very little of the financial cost of disasters. FEMA and the federal government shoulder about, let's say, 3/4 of the costs of climate disasters and relief. The document advocates for moving some of that cost onto states. I heard from experts that that could be a good idea. But in general, I spoke to many scores of experts about Project 2025, and the resounding takeaway was that this would be a catastrophe for the future of climate action in the United States and for existing environmental policies that protect air, water, and livelihoods across the US. I'll leave it there.
Right. Thank you so much, Zoya. What a tight, compact, and terrifying 7 minutes. I've already got a couple great questions for you that we'll take at the end. Gary, Sister Rose, others. We see your questions, great questions, and we will ask those of Zoya at the end. I meant to add, at the top, but when introducing Zoya, we care about climate for a number of reasons as a Christian org and with our multi-faith partners. But just to name this, climate change is obviously human created, and that's human desecration of God's creation, but of all God's creation, including one another. Zoya mentioned frontline communities. So it's desecrating the land that God created that we are called to care for. It's killing endangered species, and it's harming one another, the people, the neighbors we are called to love. And when we harm people, when we leave species to go extinct, that diminishes God's image in the world. Thomas Aquinas said that every single species was created to show us a different piece of God's image. And when we kill those species, when they go extinct, when the coral reefs die off, God doesn't get smaller, but our ability to see God does. But above all, the way indigenous communities, Black and brown people, the poor, those experiencing poverty are most experienced by climate change. It is a sin to harm the EPA, the Department of the Interior, to gut these regulations, to abandon Paris. So Zoya, thank you for helping us see just how high the stakes are and why we need to be taking action here. Next, we're going to bring in Abe Bonowitz, who leads the death penalty action. Abe, I want to flag, and Abe is a friend. We've worked together a little bit. We're really glad to have you here. Abe, I'm going to put your links in the chat for everyone. I do want to flag, because if it's happening to me, I know it's going to be happening to some others. When I click on deathpenaltyaction.org, which everyone should visit and sign the petitions, I'm getting an alert from Malwarebytes, one of my security systems. So I know folks are going to see that when they click on the link, but it is the correct link. So
it's the correct link. We've been having some issues, and it's getting fixed. If you go to our social media, then Facebook, Twitter, one of the other ones. You'll be able to find the direct links to the petitions with Tron Action Network. It's been, I got to tell you, a real struggle the last couple of weeks to try to find somebody who knows how to deal with this and can do it in a timely way, but we're working on it, and I appreciate you finding that.
When you click on the link, I'll find those social links and put them in the chat too while Abe is sharing. But Abe, please take it away. Thank you.
First thing I need to do, Nathan, is just correct one thing that you said in my introduction. There are no federal executions going on. That's one of the things that President Biden has done, which is put a halt to the federal executions and appoint an attorney general who won't set execution dates. That's how the federal death penalty works, is the attorney general sets the dates, and then it's up to the president to deal with it, grant clemency or not. And I want to talk about that in a few minutes. But there are, in fact, 4 executions this week. And what's even more worrisome is that on Friday, just the other day, South Carolina became the next state, the most recent state, to resume executions after not having them for over a decade. And this year alone, 2024, you have 4 states, Idaho, Utah, South Carolina, and Indiana, setting serious execution dates for the first time in over a decade. Idaho tried. They had their guy on the gurney, tried to kill him, couldn't get an IV started, sent him back to his cell, and they're trying to set a new date for that. Utah did carry out its first execution since, I think, 2011. South Carolina just carried out its first execution in over a decade. Indiana's is a maybe. They set December 18th to execute a very severely mentally ill man, and so 1 week before Christmas, right on time, right? So we'll see what happens. But the worst of the worst in terms of the states are carrying out executions this week. Tomorrow night in Texas, tomorrow night at the same time, an innocent guy in Missouri, and then on Thursday morning in Oklahoma, a man who never killed anybody, Emmanuel Littlejohn, who admits to being in the robbery, but all the witnesses say it was the taller, darker man who carried out the murder. And in fact, Emmanuel is the lighter, shorter man. He got a death sentence. The actual shooter got a life sentence. And we're asking Governor Stitt to act on the recommendation for clemency to halt that execution. And then at 6 o'clock on Thursday Central Time, we'll see the next gas suffocation execution in the country in Alabama. And that's why I'm on the Zoom from Birmingham, Alabama, actually just a few blocks from where the horrific shooting happened the other night. So we want to keep all those people on our prayers. Anyway, all that is to say, we're having a spike in executions, and the fear, and we've heard Donald Trump talking about this, is that there will be an immediate escalation in executions and an intentional providing of better resources to states that want to have executions. One of the challenges has been getting the execution drugs. They've figured that out. But all that being said, Donald Trump and his bluster about the death penalty, it's just that, it's bluster. Because what we know is that actually a lot of people who support Donald Trump and who even are red-hatted MAGA supporters actually oppose the death penalty, which is why when you had many people aren't even aware that there was a resumption of federal executions in the last 6 months of Donald Trump's term. 13 people were executed. But Donald Trump said only a brief statement after the first one, and then nothing more came out of his mouth publicly about the executions that were going on. And in fact, the campaign also sent an email out saying Donald Trump just killed this horrible guy, and Joe Biden needs to say why he wouldn't. And that email fell flat, I guess, for them, because they never sent another email touting Donald Trump's executions. And yet they continued all the way up through January 16th was the last of the federal execution sprees. And I'm going to share my screen now because I want to show you what it says in the 2025 agenda on page 554. Enforce the death penalty where appropriate and applicable. Capital punishment is a sensitive matter, as it should be, but the current crime wave makes deterrence vital at the federal, state, and local levels. However, providing this punishment without ever enforcing it provides justice neither for the victim families or for the defendant. The next conservative administration should therefore do everything possible to obtain finality for the 44 prisoners currently on federal death row. There's also a military death penalty, and with a few people on that death row. It should also pursue the death penalty for applicable crimes, particularly heinous crimes involving violence and sexual abuse of children, until Congress says otherwise through legislation. And I think that's the most important part of this statement. I think it was written by somebody who's very uncomfortable with the death penalty. And yet that's the policy that they want to pursue until they don't have it. There's an organization that we're allied with called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty, which is all kinds of people that you wouldn't imagine. Among our favorites is a guy named Ron McAndrew, who's a red hat wearing MAGA supporter all the way. But he also carried off the last 3 executions in Florida by electric chair as the warden of Florida State Prison. And the men he executed come and visit him in his dreams. And he talks about how he will talk about this to the end of his days, that there should not be a death penalty because of what it does to the people, the state workers who have to carry out these executions. So I think that across the board, there's, people come at it from different perspectives, but there's deep discomfort. And that's the other key thing in this, which is inspiring to me, actually, is this idea that until Congress says otherwise, which is why, when we get, and maybe you can find the links to this, but when we get to, and I'll send them to you as well, when we get to the next administration and the next Congress, we have an opportunity to pass the Federal Death Penalty Prohibition Act. And that's why we have on our webpage, I'm going to share this. If you just get down here and you get to this section right here, send a letter to your members of Congress to pass the Federal Death Penalty Prohibition Act, and send a message to President Biden and also Vice President Harris, because what we know is next is Joe Biden's going to be lame duck, and he had a commitment to end the federal death penalty. So the legislation is there. It's sponsored by Dick Durbin and Ayanna Pressley. We've got about 100 co-sponsors on the bill, and lots of organizations have signed on, including yours, and we're grateful for that. And to our sign-on letter that has been delivered to the Biden administration repeatedly. I'll note the last time by our board chair, Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother and 2 cousins were among the 9 people shot by Dylan Roof in that Charleston church massacre that happened in 2015. So our board chair, her is a murder victim family member with arguably the most famous person on federal death row right now. And I guess he could go 50-50 with Dotan Tsarnaev, the Boston bomber. But in any case, what we know is that regardless of who wins the election, the opportunity for Joe Biden to act by commuting all those death sentences is ripe, and he should do it on day 1 of the lame duck session, right after the election. And if Harris wins, then wonderful. He can take it off her plate, and she doesn't have to worry about it. If Trump somehow wins, then at least he'll pull away the opportunity for Donald Trump to continue his federal execution spree, which we know he would do in a heartbeat because he personally relishes the dictator-like power to be able to decide life and death for people. I say that from a personal perspective because our organization doesn't take a position on political candidates, but we want people to know where people stand. And ultimately, there's not a ton about criminal justice matters in the plan, but what it says about the death penalty is kind of half-assed. I mean, it's really, we should do this while we have it. But I'm excited that whoever wrote that really made it seem like they don't really want it. So I'm looking forward to questions, and if you have any further things I could talk about right now before we go, then I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Abe. Thank you so much, especially in the middle of your busy week. I've put links to all of to Death Penalty Action's Facebook and Twitter in the chat. I know folks, our settings may be wrong that folks can't click on them or copy them, but we will be sending all of these links out in a separate email along with the YouTube video for today. I've also just put in 2 links to a couple of articles about Project 2025 and the death penalty. One making the exact point you just made that Trump is going to pursue this hard. Project 2025 shows that it's a priority, so Biden needs to take care of the death penalty now while he can, before Project 2025 can be implemented should Trump win. And a second article that goes a little deeper into some footnotes that were on the section you shared about how Project 2025 also encourages the Trump administration to push the Supreme Court to overturn some precedents on the death penalty and make it easier still for the Justice Department to pursue it even more. So thank you, Abe. And my apologies also for, of course, there's a moratorium on executions right now. Of course, all the executions are state, not federal. I misread some tweets earlier from friends, but that's still why we should not be using social media for our news. My bad. Thank you.
It's okay because it's a fear, and ultimately what we want people to know is that whether you support the death penalty or not, we know we can be saved from dangerous offenders and hold them accountable without executions, because that's what we do in the vast majority of cases. It's nothing but a scare tactic, and they hardly ever use it, so we shouldn't use it at all. Thanks.
Thank you, Abe. Really appreciate you. And to round out our panel, we turn now to Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons from the Interfaith Alliance, where he is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy. And we've asked Guthrie to talk about a couple different issues, both LGBTQ rights and equality, as well as abortion access. And this is where Project 2025 gets not just contradictory to the gospel and our values, but straight up Christian nationalist, rooting its agenda in a fundamentalist warping of our faith. And Guthrie, also please talk about what Interfaith Alliance has been doing about Project 2025 and the wonderful resources webpage you've put out, which I'll put in the chat.
Thanks so much, Nathan. And it's great to be back with the Faithful America community. I've been a fan and collaborator of Faithful America since at least 2011. I think it may go back a little further than that. And it's always a great opportunity to connect with the community. I first went through Project 2025 myself in August of 2023. So more than a year ago, I didn't read every word because it's over 900 pages, but I skimmed the document and paid more attention to elements like the Health and Human Services section written by Roger Severino, a Trump administration official and huge Christian nationalist. And I believe, the first to publish an analysis of Project 2025 and its theocratic elements for MSNBC on September 8th of 2023. And so I've been talking about this for over a year, but I'm glad to see that more and more people are paying attention, because Project 2025 outlines in real terms, we're focused on a lot of the rhetoric of the campaign and the personalities, and former President Trump has a cult of personality around him. But Project 2025 makes the stakes so clear. And the stakes that I'm going to talk about specifically today are how Project 2025 will impact LGBTQ people, especially trans Americans, as well as restrict abortion access. And all of that under the guise of promoting a fundamentalist interpretation of Scripture. Is my screen showing? Nathan, can you give me a yes if it's up?
I can see it. It looks great.
Great. A little bit more about Interfaith Alliance. We were founded 30 years ago in 1994 to be a response to the Christian Coalition that we needed to organize across religious lines to have a counterforce in our politics and public life. And so we've been focused. We have a resource page on Project 2025, and we're also working with our partners in the pro-democracy space to name the threat of authoritarian theocracy. That while many of these policy proposals, especially as they pertain to LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights, will be familiar because they come from a conservative policy playbook that we all know. At the same time, they're being implemented in this authoritarian way, gutting checks and balances. And so we're raising the alarm about authoritarian theocracy. So when I first went through it, and I maintain this still a year later, the most alarming element of Project 2025 to me was a section that said, called on it's all in nonpartisan terms. So it's the next conservative president to maintain a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. There is a real attempt to undermine the secular nature of our democracy here, because we have a Supreme Court that made marriage equality the law of the land in Obergefell. And then after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, which we thought was also settled law, there was an alarm that this activist, right-wing extremist Supreme Court may overturn Obergefell as well. And so Congress acted and passed the Respect for Marriage Act, which codified same-sex marriage and interracial marriage, which had not been done by Congress, into federal law and provided those federal protections for same-sex and interfaith couples. In this section that Severino wrote in the HHS section of the report, it refers to the Respect for Marriage Act as a non-religious definition of marriage. Of course, we don't have religious and non-religious definitions of marriage. We have one Congress that is not a religious body and enacts laws in our secular democracy. And the idea that there are biblically based religious definitions of marriage and that then there's a non-religious definition of marriage is totally contrary to our system of government, and shows that this Heritage Foundation project, Project 2025, does not respect same-sex marriage as settled law, whether that was the Supreme Court that did it or the United States Congress. I pulled out some of the most alarming quotes. The next secretary should also reverse the Biden administration's focus on LGBTQ equity. The Biden administration has looked at LGBTQ equity across the administration, and so that will be immediately rolled back. All of the attempts by the Biden administration to protect LGBTQ people will be rolled back. There's also an attempt by Project 2025's authors to, quote, restrict the application of Bostock. That's another Supreme Court case that applied Title VII protections based around sex discrimination to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity. So we have in writing policy, black and white on the page, we have them calling to limit the application of Supreme Court decisions. So not just Obergefell in terms of same-sex marriage, but also Bostock, the two of the biggest rulings of my lifetime in terms of advancing LGBTQ rights. Project 2025 is going to undermine, and it's out there for us all to see. There is in the education section, and there's a lot in the, they want to do away with the U.S. Department of Education. There's a whole, we could spend hours just talking about their education policies, but specifically there are attempts to undermine teaching about trans Americans and trans Americans' existence, book bans, and limiting the information people have about LGBTQ people, and taking the Don't Say Gay from Florida and expanding that nationally. And just all kinds of culture warrior, fundamentalist language is in this document. Make the institutions of American society hard targets for woke culture warriors. And then it doesn't just apply domestically either. There's also talk in the State Department chapter. There are other problematic things in the State Department chapter, like preferencing Christians in our international religious freedom advocacy around the world, which is very problematic. When you preference one religion, you undermine everyone's religious freedom. But specifically on LGBTQ rights, they specifically call for rollbacks of how the Biden administration has advanced LGBTQ equality around the world. Again, framing it as something, equality for all as part of the culture wars. Then on abortion access, they talk about a Department of Life and a cross-government agenda that really will restrict abortion access in ways unimaginable to us, definitely in my lifetime. Pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscious rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. Of course, this not ideology is an attack on healthcare for trans Americans, portraying gender-affirming care as woke ideology. And yet we know this is gaslighting. We know all of this is rooted, all of Project 2025 is rooted in ideology and the Christian-Nationalist ideology, fundamentalists. And yet here it's somehow portraying this as biological and non-ideological, which is just comical. Defines the life as beginning from the moment of conception, which will have implications for IVF. Of course, there's a big debate right now. We saw former President Trump talking about protecting reproductive rights and loves IVF and has never read Project 2025. And yet at the same time, we know there are so many links between many of the authors of Project 2025 were former Trump administration officials. And then just last week on Thursday, I was at a hearing at the U.S. House Oversight Committee where they had 4 people from Project 2025 testifying on behalf of the Republicans, 2 authors, one who authored the Environmental Protection Agency chapter in Project 2025, and then 3 others who were affiliated with the project. And so there's this weird effort to distance the Trump campaign and from some of the more problematic elements of this. And yet we know this is the playbook. It's the only playbook if Trump were to win election. They don't need Congress. All this debate about you may have seen the debate between Trump and Harris. And there was all this talk about would you veto a national abortion ban? And Trump said, he kind of wouldn't answer and said he kept saying it's up to the states. But we know that they can advance an abortion ban backdoor by using the Comstock Act, which is, if you're not familiar with it, an act from 1873 that, in light of the Dobbs decision, some in the far right fetal personhood movement have called for using the Comstock Act to ban abortion, and starting with medication abortion and calling on the FDA with no real grounds to do this, calling for the FDA to reverse abortion pills being approved for usage. And all of this, whether it's LGBTQ rights or restricting abortion access, is done in this way of reinforcing that the next conservative president will be defending Christianity. If authoritarian theocracy and authoritarianism comes to the United States, it will be done in the name of protecting Christianity and returning God to the public square. In the introduction to the Project 2025, Heritage Foundation Kevin Roberts makes it clear. He says, today the left is threatening the tax-exempt status of churches and charities that reject woke progressivism. There's this idea that the left is, without evidence, trying to go after the tax-exempt status of churches, and that there's this threat to Christianity that needs to be protected. So at the same time that they're wanting to pass restrictive policies, there's this element of doing it because Christians are facing persecution. Across LGBTQ rights and abortion access is the expansion of religious refusals. So this is something we saw during the Trump administration, which was the use of, if you say it's if you have a religious claim, it's protecting your conscience to not provide health care or social services, which could impact foster and adoption care agencies from working with same-sex couples. It impacts people needing abortion access and being denied because of the religious beliefs of the provider or the hospital or healthcare entity overall. And then, so it's both expanding religious exemptions in healthcare, but then also opening up more taxpayer money to go to religious exemptions. So we'll have more and more of our taxpayer-funded services. Again, your taxpayer money is going to go to more and more to religious organizations that are exempt from any kind of regulation that the government might have around non-discrimination for LGBTQ people, or providing access to reproductive health care options. So it is not a good picture, but I wanted to end with something that we have been saying at Interfaith Alliance, which is we don't just need a negative understanding of all the threats out there, but we've been trying to promote this idea of Promise 2025, that we know that the vast majority of people of faith in this country support abortion access, support LGBTQ rights, and we want to see laws that expand access and expand human flourishing, not just calling out the negative. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Guthrie. I love that. Project 2025 versus Promise 2025. Our friends over at Network, the Catholic Lobby for Social Justice, have a similar approach. They're talking about Project 2025 as an attack on Catholic social justice values, and they're calling it a future for few versus a future for all, very similar to Promise 2025, that future for all. So thank you for uplifting that positive message after terrifying us to death, which is what I invited you here to do. I'm going to share for just a quick minute, and then I'm going to invite all our panelists to come back on camera. We'll talk about, we'll take some questions. But of course, the biggest question we always get is, other than, will this webinar be recorded? Yes, we will get you the link soon. The biggest question is always, what can I do? What can we do? What are the action steps we can take? And I have three and a half things I'm going to encourage you to do. First, if you haven't seen it already, it went out this weekend. There's a new sign-on statement, call it a petition from Faithful America, showing that Christians reject Project 2025. Now, this isn't a traditional petition. We're not sending it to somebody except the media, because it's really important to undermine the religious right and white Christian nationalism's claim that they represent all of Christianity, that if you share their Christian identity, you have to share their politics, you have to share Project 2025. And that claim, that lie, is how the religious right and Christian nationalism have built their power over these last 40 or 50 years. Part of what Faithful America does is speak up and work press relations to make sure that different Christian voices are being heard now as well. When we show that Christianity is diverse and that there are many of us who reject this radical extremist fundamentalist agenda, it chips away at the lie that the religious right uses to build its power, and that brings their power down. So speak up. We'll be sharing the top lines from this petition, the number of people who sign it with the media, and that always makes a big difference. The second thing I want to encourage you to do, and this might seem obvious, is to vote. But the kicker is, don't just vote. Vote for all the lower levels. In our last webinar, we talked about how Project 2025 is already being implemented at the state level. It's not theoretical. It's not too extreme to happen. And it's not hypothetical in the future if elections go a certain way. It's not just federal. It's already happening, and we've got to be voting at every level in every race. Bring your values with you to the polls. Be a good citizen, as well as being a good Christian. Those are not always the same thing, but in this case, we've got to speak up and speak out at every level. So please vote. Get people to vote. How do you do that? Last point: get people to vote. That's the third thing we want you to do, is to be talking about Project 2025. At the start of the webinar, I shared some polling that shows that talking about Project 2025 is one of the best ways to get people to make up their minds in this election against Donald Trump. And it is one of the best ways to motivate people to vote once they've made up their mind. So please be having these conversations. People will always say, can you give us some talking points? To that, I will say we are working on a toolkit. We'll have it ready soon. Please check out what Interfaith Alliance has already put together. The link is in the chat. But ultimately, it's not about having the right scripture or the right talking points, because when we blast those at people, they just feel argued with. They don't remember the talking points we told them. They just remembered, oh, you argued with me, you debated with me, I felt debated and hostile. And none of us feel good when we feel that way, and our minds don't change. The way to have these conversations is to listen, to be gentle, to say, hey, well, I know that you're dismissing Project 2025. Can I ask you why? Can I ask you which values are most important to you? And then you can say, hey, you know what? Those are actually the same values that matter to me. I care deeply about family, or whatever it may be. Isn't it really interesting that we're coming at it from different sides of the issue, but we share the same values? And you can slowly lean into the way that Project 2025 impacts those specific values. But after listening, after making your friend or family member felt heard, and then tailoring it to their story, because they're an individual person with their own thoughts, magic, full-tested talking points may not work on their particular context. How is Project 2025 going to affect them? Who is that gay nephew or bisexual niece or even trans cousin they really care about and didn't know how their freedoms would be harmed by Project 2025? Or they're maybe the one issue they're not following Trump on is immigration. Maybe they care about being safe in their workplace. What do they bring up and talk about how Project 2025 takes away those freedoms? I'm going to put 5 words in the chat that you can use in these conversations, because polling is showing that these are the 5 words that people are most associating with Project 2025. Extreme, far right, authoritarian, anti-democratic, and dangerous. So talk about the positives, like Guthrie said, talk about promise, talk about a future for all, talk about freedom, talk about the things that are under threat. But you can use these 5 words to describe the threat, because those are the words that are resonating in people's minds. The third and a half thing I want to say, because it's very similar to talking about it, please, if you were a preacher, you can preach on Project 2025. Now, do not violate the separation of church and state. We're not asking you to tell your congregation how they should vote, who to vote for, who to vote against, what party to support or oppose. That's inappropriate legally, and I would also say theologically, but we can educate on the issues. Preachers can talk about the issues. If you're not a preacher, you can ask your pastor or preacher to address the issues. We can encourage people to vote. We should encourage them to vote as a way of giving, raising up the rights and equality of the least of these, making every voice heard. And we can say, when you vote, vote with your values in mind. And to understand the stakes in this election and to talk about what our values are, I want to address something you may have heard about in the press called Project 2025. You can share that Project 2025 has been written by Christian-Nationalist organizations, and you want to make it clear that your church is not aligned with them, that does not speak for your faith, despite their claims to speak for all Christians. And you can say that the freedoms that are threatened in Project 2025 are contradictory, that threat is contradictory to the values your church expresses, to your understanding of Jesus's teachings. And so you're sharing about Project 2025 so that people know what values are at stake, what the stakes are in this election, why it's important to vote. That's all legally permissible under IRS guidance. You don't have to mention Donald Trump. You don't have to say that to oppose Project 2025, you must vote against Trump. Don't do that. Just talk about the values and the stakes. After all, Project 2025 was written by a charity too. The Heritage Foundation is a C3, just like your church. So please sign the statement, vote, especially down ballot, talk about this, preach about this. With that, I'm going to invite, I'm going to put one last list of links in the chat, which are a few other recommended Project 2025 resources and toolkits. Now I'm hearing that folks are having a hard time copy pasting what's in the chat, but you should still be able to click on the links, open them in your browser. You can copy the link there to save it. And again, we'll include these in the caption on the YouTube video, and probably, and if we ever upload this as a podcast, you'll find those in the podcast description, and an email that goes out with the link. So with that, I'm going to invite all our panelists back on camera, and we are going to move into Q&A. And I know there's a chance that Abe might have to leave us a few minutes early. So I wanted to send, if I can find where I put my questions, the first question for you, Abe, in case you have to leave early. This is a question from me. Are you at all concerned about the way that Project 2025 is trying to remove the Justice Department's independence? Could this agenda, if enacted, make it easier for a president to push prosecutors to pursue the death penalty even when they don't want to?
Well, we've already seen that, and we saw that with, previously with other administrations, and with the Trump administration wanted to tell prosecutors what to do. In fact, the Native American that was executed by Donald Trump was put there because the Attorney General, Ashcroft in this case, overrode the local prosecutors from their own decision-making power. But you're exactly right. Part of the problem with this is it replaces a lot of civil servants with appointed positions, and it also puts everybody at fear for their job if you're not doing what the administration wants, and gives them much more power to be able to just say, well, we're going to change the nature of your job and you're gone. So that would be a big fear. again, I'm feeling less. When we rephrase that, I was going to say I feel less concerned because I don't know how Donald Trump could possibly be elected. However, that's what I thought 4 years ago too, or 8 years ago. So, that's I think to succinctly answer your question, we don't know how deeply they could go if they have the opportunity to try to enact this, and that's why it's a very dangerous thing.
Thank you, Abe. And of course, even if regardless how the federal election goes, we know that Project 2025 can also be used as a blueprint at the state level.
Yes, well, and that's really, the thing. If you were on at the very beginning when I talked about how we have a number of states that have resumed executions after more than a decade, it's almost as if there's a memo going around among Republican and conservative attorneys general. Because, for example, after the first gas suffocation execution in January, right away, the very next day, Dave Yost, the Attorney General in Ohio, came out and with a press conference introducing a bill to enact gas executions in Ohio. We've been able to hold that bill off so far, and we killed such bills in Nebraska and Kansas this year. Unfortunately, the one in Louisiana passed, but they're all talking amongst themselves about how do we get executions going? How do we have more of them? So, yeah, the blueprint is out there, and that is exactly why you're right when you say you got to vote the entire down ballot, all the way down the ballot. Anybody that is possibly going to support the 2025 agenda type of things or a MAGA administration, vote against them.
Thank you, Abe. Zoya, you touched on this, but I think there's room to go deeper. Sister Rose asked, I heard that Project 2025 would just completely pull down the EPA. Is this true?
Not quite. I think that a better way to put it would be sort of dismantling the EPA's or separating the EPA's enforcement powers from its rulemaking powers. So the blueprint aims to really divorce these different agencies' various skills and powers from each other. For example, I'm thinking about the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They, under this, rubric, they would be able to, for example, collect data on Lyme disease in Connecticut, but they wouldn't be able to tell people what to do about that. Like if they, for example, recorded a spike, a very intense spike in Lyme disease, they wouldn't be able to tell communities in Connecticut, okay, this is what you should do. Here's, proactive measures you should take. So it's it's like a divorcing, and the same thing applies to the EPA and almost any other agency under this blueprint is, you can collect data, you can't tell states what to do with that data. So it kind of kneecaps the EPA, but it doesn't destroy it or tear it down completely.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that is really important is to correct a lot of the misinformation about Project 2025. There is a lot of it. There are a lot of proposals that have been made on the right, but aren't actually in Project 2025. And yet we do see a lot, especially in social media, circulating saying that's in there. And that can discredit the left if we're saying the wrong things about Project 2025. So thank you for that clarification. So Project 2025 doesn't propose getting rid of the EPA, but there are a lot of agencies it does talk about eliminating. Can you share a bit about what it would mean for climate change and in particular extreme weather events like hurricanes if the suggestion to eliminate the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, or the National Weather Service came to pass?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's been talked about a lot. So anytime you look at your phone and check the weather, more often than not, those are government satellites that are feeding that data to your phone on whether it's going to rain that day or not. And so what this would do, what Project 2025 would do is it would prevent those satellites from operating, which is, it falls in the category of provisions in the document that experts told me are flat out bizarre. And there's a reason for that. The blueprint also wants to keep the National Hurricane Center, which uses National Weather Service satellites and data to make its hurricane forecasts. So some of these things are just nonsensical. So, you want to get rid of the National Weather Service, but you want to keep the National, Hurricane Center, and it doesn't really make sense, how the Hurricane Center would operate without that government data. So I think some of those proposals can be, we don't want to write them off completely because in his first term, Trump has, he proved that he could make decisions that made little to no sense. But it would be very, very difficult to implement something like getting rid of NOAA, for example. Everyone I spoke to had no idea how that would actually work.
Bizarre or perhaps weird. Thank you, Zoya. Folks, keep the questions coming. Put them in the Q&A box down below. Type them now. And we'll go for about another 15 minutes, perhaps, if there are enough questions. Guthrie, 2 questions for you. First, Carlin had a really interesting question. Carlin understands how a lot of anti-choice bills can ultimately be racist. Carlin understands how the death penalty disproportionately impacts people of color. She knows folks who are really concerned about racism and white supremacy, but aren't necessarily concerned about a lot of the other policies in Project 2025. She's wondering if you could talk about the way that attacking LGBTQ rights disproportionately impacts LGBTQ people of color, because that shows us how ultimately that's yet another racist chapter of Project 2025.
It certainly does. I don't have the specific statistics up, but I know the Center for American Progress does an annual study about health of LGBTQ people and shows how restrictive policies target LGBTQ people of color in particular. Something that when I saw Carlin's question that came to mind, though, is what I was talking about, using religion as an excuse to discriminate. Was not an idea invented to undermine LGBTQ rights. There's a great piece that maybe we can share in the chat from the Washington Post about that discrimination was done by segregationists and slaveholders in the name of religion, that there's a long history of using religion to divide based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's part of a long, ugly history. But there's also a history, this is what I wrote about in my book, throughout American history, throughout world history, of Christians advocating for civil rights. So as much as we talk about the religious case for segregation, we need to talk about all the Christians and people of other faiths that were active in the civil rights movement, have been active in the LGBTQ rights movement, the reproductive rights movement. One of my professors from Union Seminary was talking to me about how Roe was going to be overturned. And I was in seminary 2015, 2016, and she saw Roe being overturned coming. And she was talking about being part of the clergy consultation service that was helping women get abortions before Roe, on acting out their faith, and she was ready to do it again. So I think there are all these intersectional ties of discrimination and oppression, and yet there's also a growing solidarity and movement for social, racial, economic justice that's informed by faith as well.
Thank you, Guthrie. I have another question for you, but first, Abe, I know has to leave in about 2 minutes. So if there are any other questions for Abe, drop them in now. And Abe has just shared some links with me that I've passed along in the chat to some of the specific petitions from death penalty action about some upcoming executions, unfortunately. Abe, if there are no more questions, thank you so much. We know that you're doing the Lord's work. It's a really busy week for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, and keep everybody in your prayers for those that are being executed, their families, as well as the families of the victims, and even the people who are carrying out these executions. You know, when we ask government officials to kill in all of our names, we're asking them to take on a lifelong burden, and it's unfair, and it's one of the reasons why we should get rid of executions. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Abe. Guthrie, another question for you. It was a simple one, but I feel so happy for the several folks who asked the same question. They didn't understand the point about wokeism. What is wokeism? What is progressive woke? So I'm jealous that they have missed that part of the dialogue. Could you expand a bit on about what was meant by that bullet point in your slides?
Yeah, wokeism is an entire effort on the far right extremist movements to tie together rights for transgender Americans, for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Talking about the ties between racism and LGBTQ oppression, we see it in these attacks on woke, attacks on affirmative action, attacks on any push for diversity, pluralism, inclusion, respect, human dignity are termed as woke. And then, but there's also sort of more overt in one of the quotes I didn't include in the presentation was how Project 2025 talks about children suffer the toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and pornography invading their school libraries. We've heard a lot about how libraries have gone woke because they, trans people are allowed to be in the libraries, and books that include LGBTQ subjects are not banned. So woke is an attempt to reverse all of the civil rights gains that have happened in this country over the past 60 years. And instead portray diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as anti-white or anti-straight or anti-male, that any attempt to have justice for people that have been oppressed is actually oppressing the majority oppressor. What would you, is that how you would define woke, Nathan? What would you say?
I'll be honest, I'm looking at questions to try and pick the next one, and I'm catching half what you said. But what I caught was the first half, which was where you really got into woke. And yeah, that matches it. I think I think this is where you were wrapping up, but like they're always flipping the language against people. Woke was what Black Lives Matter described itself. Get woke, stay woke. So they grab these words and try to use them against folks. So I will happily say that I got woke and want to stay woke. At least I hope I'm still woke. May I be the social justice warrior they mock me for being. Don't let that sort of recognize when they're using those words, when Ron DeSantis is explicitly attacking those words, that they're trying to turn this into cultural wars, that it's not about policy, it is about attacking people. And that's why they're using vague words like that to attack the people who created those words. That's kind of some of the point you made about the oppressed and the oppressor.
And I would say it's a particular political strategy to pick on the most vulnerable. You may have noticed, and it's evident in Project 2025, how there's been a shift towards attacking gay and lesbians and LGBTQ people at large, to specifically targeting trans Americans for discrimination, ridicule, and trying to score political points by attacking trans people. And that's intentional because it's a very small community, and there's also fewer people know trans people than know gay and lesbian people. So there's fewer personal allies. And yet that's even more disturbing, that you'd find the smallest, most marginalized group and try to profit off attacking them.
Thank you, Guthrie. I want to take a question really quickly because it's not something we've covered today with this panel, but it's really important. Murray asked if there are specifics about what Project 2025 does to Social Security and to Medicare. And my understanding is the Center for American Progress has said Project 2025 will restrict Medicare enrollees' choices. So when you have those plans you can pick from, really restricts things. And of course, that would likely disproportionately impact people experiencing poverty. It also says Project 2025 would raid the Medicare trust fund and the money set aside for Medicare, which matters a great deal, especially with the baby boom retiring. On Social Security, I can't find a lot out there. Most of what I find is about, I have not seen a lot about Social Security Project 2025. I haven't read all 900 pages. A lot of what I find when I search for that is what Project 2025 authors have suggested, not what is actually in Project 2025. And that's really important to remember because Project 2025 is written by and is recruiting those who would stock the Trump administration with staff. And so it shows us the way they think about power. And there's a lot they're going to do that isn't in here, but you can plug into how they think about power, the political strategies Guthrie just shared that we see in the document. And at the same time, we want to get our facts straight when talking about the project so that we're not perpetuating misinformation as well. So there have been a number of things like the Republican Study Committee and in the House and a variety of, I think that's the House, maybe that's the Senate, the RSC and a number of Republican senators explicitly saying, let's privatize Social Security. But we can't say they did that in Project 2025. We can't say Trump has said that, but we can say that Republican congressional policy committees have proposed that. We can say their movement has proposed that. Now, Zoya, I have a question for you. There was an early question really early on in the webinar that I want to reframe a bit to be a climate question. Mark asked if Project 2025 negatively impacts free enterprise in favor of Wall Street, which is a great point because we think about how we have free enterprise when really Wall Street is crushing mom and pop businesses. There is no free market with all the regulation favoring big corporations. But I would tweak that to specifically ask, are there ways that that Project 2025 and the way it affects the regulatory infrastructure might impact clean energy businesses and all of the startups that we've seen around clean energy tech and climate solutions? Is it going to strangle what we've seen build up at the federal level to support that kind of new energy infrastructure?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think that actually is sort of the $1 million question, because as many of you likely know, the Inflation Reduction Act directed hundreds of billions of dollars towards states for clean energy tax credits and projects for companies to go green, and also to develop new technologies. So the question is, that money is going out the door right now. If Trump were to be reelected, what would happen to that money? Does it get pulled back? A lot of Republican states are benefiting from these clean energy tax credits. From a lot of Republican states like the initiatives and are could potentially lobby to keep them. That has happened before. So the question really is, how much of that gets pulled back? Because this document does advocate for doing that, for stopping the IRA. It sees the IRA as a massive government overreach. The question, of course, is I talked to the Federal Reserve and folks in Congress, and no one seems to really know the answer to this question. What happens next? So I think we'll just have to stay tuned, sort of collectively, for how this all goes down. There may be some legal stuff. We'll see what shakes out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zoya. I forgot to warn you that I always finish with the same question. So I want to put this question to both of you, and I wish I had asked Abe in particular before he left, although Abe hinted at his answer. Amidst all these threats or proposed threats in this authoritarian document, what gives you hope? Zoya, let's start with you because you're still unmuted.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I'll be short. I'm very glad to have provided the climate lens in this conversation. I think that I have never been invited to speak. I'm often invited to speak at panels. It's a thing that a lot of Grist reporters do. There's not that many journalists covering climate change, but I've never spoken to a group like this, and it makes me very hopeful that there's interest in climate change, because it really does affect all of us, and it is a growing issue that many of us are incredibly concerned about. So especially when it comes to future generations. So I think I just am leaving feeling hopeful that this perspective was included and that you all had questions about the blueprint and how it might affect climate policy, and I'm heartened by that.
Thank you, Zoya. Guthrie, what gives you hope?
Sure. After watching a lot of the Olympics last month, sports metaphors have been on my mind. And so I think this work of social justice and promoting democracy, promoting religious freedom, is something that generations that have gone before us have tried to do and advanced. And we're in a great relay race of achieving democracy together and making the promises of democracy that have made this country so special more real for more people in our lifetimes. And so I find great hope in knowing that we didn't all start this race. We've been handed the baton to carry it forward as best we can for a set amount of time. And then there are many younger people out there. I was just on a Zoom the other day talking about Gen Alpha and Gen Z and their views on social justice. And it's very inspiring to me to know that we have our work to do, and then generations after us will come forward and protect the environment and reverse the damage we did, and also hopefully make the world better. So let's just do our part with the time we're given.
Thank you, Guthrie. I always say, the same things, that my hope first and foremost is as a priest, as a Christian, my hope is in the resurrection. You said we did not start this work. We may or may not finish it, but it goes on. We do our part. And with that hope of the resurrection, we remember we are part of a story that began before us, ends after us, but goes on. It is eternal. And I have hope in all the people who do that work, including the 400 plus who joined us today. Thank you so much to all 200,000 Faithful America members, but especially to you 400 who are here, and to you who are watching this on YouTube and Facebook later, for taking time out on a Monday afternoon, for taking time from your day, from your work day, to learn about this, to get involved. Thank you for what you're going to be doing. It really does give me hope, as does, you know, the great work that journalists do. Thank you, Zoya. Independent journalism is under such attack right now from market pressures and more. And Guthrie, all our collaborations wherever you go, and all our collaborations with the Interfaith Alliance before you got there, I mean, those things give me hope. So many wonderful partners in this work. So my thank you to the two of you. My thank you to Abe Bonowitz, who had to drop off earlier. Please, folks, please remember, sign the Faithful America's New Statement on Project 2025. Check out Interfaith Alliance's Guide to the Issue. Talk about this with your friends and neighbors. If you can, preach about this. Above all, vote, pray, vote, and take some more action. And remember, you are loved. Accept it, spread it, love your neighbors, no exceptions, and we'll see you out there. God bless.